A retired engineer bought an abandoned military facility for cheap. The government said all the buildings were empty and safe. But when he opened a storage room that had been frozen shut since 1962, he found something inside that was still alive, still waiting, still dangerous after 60 years. Henry Davis was 70 years old and looking for a project. 45 years of engineering work, and he'd saved enough to retire comfortably. His wife Dorothy had died 2 years back. His kids were grown and living across the country. Henry was alone in Seattle with time and money and nothing to do. That's when he saw the auction listing. Old military research facility in eastern Washington, built in the 1950s, abandoned in 1964. 200 acres with buildings for $50,000. Henry could afford that, could spend his retirement fixing the place up, maybe turning it into something useful. He drove out to see it on a Thursday. The facility sat in the middle of nowhere, desert landscape, sagebrush and rocks. The buildings were concrete, built to last. Most were falling apart from 40 years of neglect, but the main research building looked solid. Thick walls, small windows, built like a bunker. The real estate agent was a young man named Chris Martinez. He seemed nervous about showing the property. "Mr. Davis, I have to be honest. This place has a reputation. Local people won't come near it. Say strange things happened here during the Cold War." Henry wasn't worried about ghost stories. He was an engineer, believed in facts and science, not rumors. "I'll take it." The paperwork took 3 weeks. The government made him sign documents saying he understood the risks, that there might be hazardous materials, that he was buying as is with no guarantees. Henry signed everything. He'd dealt with industrial sites before, knew about contamination and cleanup. This couldn't be worse than some of the factories he'd worked in. He moved into the facility with a trailer and generator, started exploring the buildings one by one. Most were empty, stripped of equipment decades ago, just concrete shells with broken windows and graffiti from trespassers. But the main research building was different. It was locked, not just locked, sealed. Heavy steel doors with government warnings. Authorized personnel only. Do not enter. Henry had keys from the auction. Tried them all. None worked on this building. The locks were old, frozen solid. Henry used cutting equipment, spent 2 days cutting through the locks and opening the steel doors. When they finally opened, cold air rushed out. Not just cool, freezing. Like opening a freezer that had been running for decades. The building's interior was dark and cold. Henry's breath fogged in the air. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The hallway was lined with doors, each one marked with numbers. Lab 1, Lab 2, storage rooms, offices. Everything was preserved by the cold. Papers on desks, equipment on tables, like people had left in the middle of working and never came back. Henry explored carefully, found labs with test tubes and microscopes, found offices with files and photos, found a cafeteria with dishes still on tables. Everything frozen in time, literally frozen by cold that shouldn't exist. The building had no power, no electricity, but somehow it was freezing inside. Henry found the source in the basement, a massive cooling system, running on its own, connected to underground cables, still powered after 60 years by something Henry didn't understand. The cables led to a room at the end of the basement, a storage room. The door was marked with warnings: extreme cold, biological materials, do not open without proper authorization. Level 4, containment required. Before you find out what Henry discovered, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We have more unbelievable stories coming your way. Henry stood in front of that door for a long time. Every instinct said, don't open it. Said leave it sealed. Said some things should stay buried. But Henry was curious. Had spent 45 years solving problems and understanding systems. He needed to know what was in there. What had been kept frozen for 60 years. He found a hazmat suit in a supply closet. Old but intact. Put it on. Found breathing equipment. Made sure he was protected. Then he opened the storage room door. The cold hit him like a wall. Even through the suit. This room was colder than the rest of the building. Much colder. Below zero. Ice covered the walls. His flashlight beam cut through fog from his breath hitting the frozen air. The room was full of containers, metal cylinders, each one sealed and labeled. Henry read the labels. Test subjects. Batch 7, 1962. Keep frozen at all times. Do not thaw under any circumstances. Henry felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Test subjects, biological materials. What had they been doing here? He examined one cylinder carefully. It had a viewing window. Thick glass covered in frost. Henry wiped the frost away. Looked inside. What he saw made him step back. There was something in there. Something organic. Something that looked almost human, but not quite. Skin that was gray. Features that were wrong. Eyes that were closed, but too large. Too dark. Henry checked another cylinder. Same thing. A figure. Human-shaped, but wrong. All the cylinders were the same. 12 of them. All containing things that looked human, but weren't. All frozen. All sealed. All waiting. Henry's hands shook as he read more labels. Found a logbook. Preserved in plastic. Opened it carefully. The entries were from 1962. Written by someone named Dr. Elizabeth Shaw. She described experiments, testing something called Subject X, a biological agent that changed human cells, made them different, made them wrong. The military had wanted to create super soldiers, people who were stronger, faster, harder to kill. Dr. Shaw had developed something, but it didn't work right. Changed people but made them dangerous, made them aggressive, made them not human anymore. The log described tests on volunteers, soldiers who'd agreed to be enhanced, who'd been injected with Subject X, who'd changed, who'd become dangerous. The facility had frozen them, sealed them, kept them contained until someone could figure out how to reverse the process. But nobody ever did. The facility was abandoned. The subjects left frozen, forgotten for 60 years. Henry closed the logbook, looked at the 12 cylinders. 12 men who'd volunteered to serve their country, who'd been changed into something not human, who'd been frozen and forgotten, left in a basement for 6 decades while the world moved on. He should report this. Call the government. Tell them what he'd found. But Henry knew what would happen. They'd seal it up again, classify everything, leave these men frozen forever. Henry made a decision. He'd document everything, take photos, record video. Then he'd figure out if there was any way to help these men, any way to reverse what had been done to them. He spent the next week documenting the facility. Every room, every file, every piece of equipment, sent copies to his lawyer, to his kids. Insurance in case something happened. Then he started researching Subject X, found references in the files. It was a virus, engineered to rewrite human DNA, make cells stronger and more efficient. But it had side effects, made people aggressive, made them lose their humanity, made them dangerous. The frozen subjects were kept that way because the virus was still active, still changing them, slowly but constantly. Freezing slowed the process, kept them contained. But if they thawed, the virus would activate fully. The subjects would become completely transformed, completely dangerous, completely not human anymore. Henry found notes from Dr. Shaw. She'd tried to develop a cure, something to reverse the virus, stop the transformation. She'd made progress, had developed something called Compound 7. It might work, but she'd never had a chance to test it. The facility had been shut down too quickly, the research classified, everything sealed and forgotten. Henry found the formula for Compound 7, detailed notes on how to synthesize it. He had a background in chemistry, had worked in pharmaceutical plants. He could make this. Could try it, could see if after 60 years there was any hope for these frozen men. He set up a lab in one of the empty buildings, ordered chemicals, spent 3 months synthesizing Compound 7, followed Dr. Shaw's notes exactly. When he finished, he had 12 doses, one for each frozen subject. Now came the hard part, testing it. Henry chose one cylinder, the first subject, a man named James Wilson according to the files. Age 25 in 1962, Army volunteer, first person injected with Subject X. Henry slowly raised the temperature in the storage room, just for that one cylinder, watched through the viewing window as ice melted. As the subject inside began to thaw, the transformation was visible. Gray skin became darker, almost black. Features became more pronounced, more wrong. Muscles grew, bones shifted. By the time the subject was fully thawed, it barely looked human. It looked like something from nightmares. And it was alive. Eyes opened, Black eyes, no whites, no iris, just black. The subject looked at Henry through the glass, seemed to recognize him as human, as prey, began hitting the cylinder, hard enough to dent the metal, hard enough to crack the thick glass. Henry had seconds. He opened the cylinder's medication port, injected compound 7, watched it enter the subject's body, waited. The subject stopped hitting, stood still, began convulsing. Skin rippled, bones shifted, changes reversed. Gray skin became normal, features became human again. The black eyes cleared, became brown, human. James Wilson looked at Henry, looked at his own hands, started crying. He was human again. Henry opened the cylinder carefully. James Wilson collapsed. 60 years of being frozen. 60 years of transformation. His body was weak despite looking strong. Henry caught him, helped him to the floor, called for an ambulance, but then he stopped. How could he explain this? A man who'd been frozen since 1962. A military experiment gone wrong. They'd take James away, seal everything up again. Henry made a different choice. He'd care for James himself, help him recover, give him time to adjust before dealing with authorities. Over the next week, James regained his strength. His memories slowly returned. He remembered volunteering, remembered the injection, remembered the transformation, remembered becoming something not human, remembered the fear and rage and hunger that had consumed him. Then nothing, just cold and darkness for what felt like forever. Henry. His voice was rough from decades of not speaking. How long? How long was I frozen? 60 years. Henry said it gently. It's 2024. James Wilson was 85 years old chronologically, but his body was still 25. The virus and freezing had stopped his aging. He looked at his hands. Young hands. Strong hands. I should be an old man. Should have lived a life. Instead, I was frozen. Because I trusted the government. Because I wanted to serve. Henry showed him the files. Showed him Dr. Shaw's notes. Showed him the other 11 cylinders. Your friends are still in there. Still frozen. Still transformed. The cure worked on you. Maybe it will work on them too. James looked at the frozen cylinders. At men he'd known. Men he'd trained with. Men who'd volunteered together. We have to save them. Have to bring them back. I can't be the only one. Henry agreed. But they'd do it carefully. One at a time. Make sure each person recovered before thawing the next. Over the next 6 months, Henry and James thawed and cured all 11 remaining subjects. Each time the compound 7 worked. Each time a transformed subject became human again. Each time a man frozen in 1962 woke up in 2024. If you're wondering what happened to these men, hit that like button and share this story. The men were traumatized. All of them. They'd been conscious during the transformation, had felt themselves becoming monsters, had been frozen while still partly aware. 60 years of cold darkness, of being not quite alive and not quite dead, of being trapped in bodies that weren't human anymore. Now they were human again, but 60 years had passed. Everyone they'd known was dead or elderly. The world had changed completely. They were strangers in a strange time. Henry helped them adjust, taught them about the modern world, about computers and cell phones and everything that had been invented while they were frozen. James became their leader, helped the others cope, helped them understand what had happened and what they'd lost. One of the men, Robert Pierce, couldn't handle it. He was 23 when frozen, would be 83 now. His wife had been 20, probably dead now. His daughter had been 2 years old, would be 62 now if she was alive. A lifetime lost. He tried to find them. His wife had died in 1980. Cancer. His daughter was alive, living in California, married, had kids, grandkids, Robert's great-grandchildren. Robert contacted her, tried to explain who he was. She didn't believe him at first, said her father died in 1962, military accident, couldn't be alive now. But DNA tests proved it. Robert Pierce was who he said he was. Her father, still young while she was old, still alive after being declared dead for 60 years. The reunion was hard. Robert's daughter, Linda, was 62. He was 23 physically, younger than her, younger than his own daughter. She looked at him with confusion and anger and grief. Where have you been? Why didn't you come back? Why did you leave me? Robert tried to explain about the experiment, about being frozen, about having no choice. Linda struggled to understand, to accept that her father hadn't abandoned her, had been a victim, had suffered in ways she couldn't imagine. But accepting it meant accepting the government had lied, had hidden the truth, had let her grow up thinking her father was dead. The other men had similar experiences. Some had families who believed them, who welcomed them back. Others had no family left. Everyone was dead. They were alone in a world they didn't understand. Henry helped all of them, used his savings to support them, helped them get identification, get social security numbers, get set up in the modern world. But he knew they needed more, needed justice, needed acknowledgement, needed the truth told. Henry contacted a lawyer, explained everything, showed the documentation. The lawyer was shocked. This is huge. This is government experimenting on soldiers, hiding the results, leaving them frozen for decades. We need to go public. Henry and the 12 subjects agreed. They held a press conference, told their story, showed the documentation, showed Dr. Shaw's notes, showed photos of the frozen facility. The response was immediate and huge. National news, congressional investigations, public outrage. How could the government do this? How could they experiment on soldiers and then abandon them? The government denied everything at first, said the facility had been closed properly, said there were no experiments, said these men were lying. But Henry had documentation, had proof, had 12 living subjects who all told the same story. The government was forced to admit the truth. Yes, they'd done experiments. Yes, Subject X had been real. Yes, the subjects had been frozen. But they said it was necessary. National security, Cold War pressures, desperate times. The public didn't accept that excuse. Experimenting on soldiers was wrong. Freezing them instead of helping them was wrong. Hiding the truth for 60 years was wrong. Congress ordered investigations. The military had to answer questions, had to explain what happened, had to account for 60 years of buried secrets. Slowly, more truth came out. The facility in Washington wasn't the only one. There were others. 4 more sites across the country, all doing similar experiments, all with frozen subjects, all hidden and forgotten. Federal teams were sent to the other facilities, found more frozen subjects. 43 men total across all 5 sites. All volunteers, all transformed by Subject X, all frozen since the early 1960s, all abandoned. Henry's Compound 7 was used to cure them. All 43 men were thawed, treated, returned to human form. All of them struggled with lost time, lost lives, lost families. But they were alive. They were human again. And they demanded justice. The government was sued. Massive class action lawsuit. All 43 subjects plus families, claiming damages for experimentation without proper consent, for being abandoned, for 60 years of stolen life. The case took 3 years. Finally, the government settled. $100 million divided among the subjects, $2 million each, plus full military benefits, plus medical care for life, plus official apologies. It wasn't enough. Money couldn't give them back 60 years. Couldn't reunite them with dead wives and parents and friends, couldn't make up for being frozen and transformed and abandoned. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was justice. Sort of. Henry used the publicity to push for more. He demanded the government search for other experiments, other hidden subjects, other buried secrets. A special office was created, the Office of Historical Military Accountability. Its job was finding and exposing old experiments, making sure no one else was frozen or hidden or forgotten, making sure this never happened again. The office found 20 more experiments, not frozen subjects, but other tests, other trials, other soldiers who'd been used as test subjects and then forgotten. All of them were contacted, all given apologies and compensation, all had their stories told. Henry became a spokesman, the engineer who'd bought a facility and found frozen men, who'd cured them, who'd fought for them, who'd forced the government to face its past. He testified before Congress, pushed for laws protecting test subjects, pushed for transparency, pushed for accountability. Some of the frozen subjects joined him. James Wilson became an advocate, traveled the country, told his story. showed people what being frozen and transformed had done, made it real, made it personal, made it impossible to ignore. Robert Pierce focused on his family, spent time with his daughter, got to know his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tried to build relationships across a 60-year gap. It was hard. He was younger than his own daughter, but he tried. They tried. Made it work as best they could. 5 years after being thawed, the 43 subjects held a reunion. Met at Henry's facility, the place where it had all started, where they'd been frozen, where Henry had found them, where Compound 7 had given them back their humanity. They walked through the empty storage room, looked at the cylinders that had held them, remembered the cold and darkness and transformation. James Wilson spoke for all of them. We lost 60 years, lost families, lost lives, but we're here. We're human. We survived something impossible, and we've made sure it never happens to anyone else. That counts for something. That has to count for something. Henry stood with them, 75 years old now, his health declining, but proud of what they'd accomplished together. You men were victims, but you became heroes. You forced accountability. You changed how the government treats soldiers. You made sure the truth came out. That matters more than the time you lost. The subjects agreed. They'd turned their suffering into purpose, their trauma into advocacy, their impossible survival into meaning. That was how you dealt with the undealing with. That was how you moved forward, not by forgetting, but by making sure it mattered. 10 years after Henry opened the frozen storage room, all 43 subjects were adjusting to modern life, some better than others. James Wilson had gone to college, got a degree in biology, worked as an advocate for veterans' rights, used his experience to help others. Robert Pierce lived near his daughter, saw his family regularly, struggled with being younger than his child, but made it work. Others had found their own paths, jobs, relationships, lives that made sense in this strange new world where they were decades out of time. Henry Davis was 77. His health was failing, heart problems. The doctors said he didn't have long, maybe months. He'd spent the last decade fighting for the frozen subjects, for accountability, for truth. Now he was tired, ready to rest. The subjects came to visit him, one by one, thanking him, telling him he'd saved their lives, given them back their humanity. Henry was grateful for their words, but he also felt guilt. Guilt for something he'd never told them, something he'd hidden for 10 years. Henry called James Wilson, asked him to bring the others. All 43 subjects gathered at Henry's house in Seattle, stood around his bed, wondering why he'd called them together. Henry pulled out a file, handed it to James. "I found this in Dr. Shaw's papers. Read it, please." James read aloud. It was a letter, written by Dr. Shaw in 1963, a year after the subjects were frozen. She'd written it to someone in the government, to a general, explaining that Subject X had been a lie, a cover story. The real experiment wasn't about creating super soldiers. That was just what they told the volunteers. The real experiment was testing how human subjects responded to extreme stress, to transformation, to being turned into monsters and frozen. It was psychological testing, seeing how much trauma humans could endure, how consciousness responded to impossible circumstances. Subject X did transform people, but that was the point. The transformation was the test. Freezing them was part of it. Seeing if consciousness could survive 60 years of cold sleep while transformed. All of it was planned. All of it was the experiment. James stopped reading, looked at Henry. "You knew?" Henry's voice was weak. "I knew. Found that letter 10 years ago, right after I thawed you all. But I couldn't tell you. Couldn't let you know the truth. You'd already suffered so much." Robert Pierce's voice was hard. "That we were test subjects the whole time? That even our transformation was intentional? That we were lab rats?" Henry nodded. Dr. Shaw felt guilty. That's why she developed Compound 7, why she left notes on how to make it. She wanted someone to eventually cure you, to give you back your humanity. But she couldn't do it herself, couldn't defy the military. So she left instructions, left hope. The subjects were quiet, processing. They'd thought they were heroes, volunteers for an important military project. Now they knew they'd been experiments, lab subjects, deliberately transformed, deliberately frozen, deliberately traumatized to see what would happen. It changed everything. changed how they saw themselves, changed what their sacrifice meant. But James Wilson thought about it, thought hard, finally spoke. It doesn't matter what they intended, what they planned. What matters is what happened. We suffered. We survived. We forced accountability. We changed things. The purpose behind our suffering doesn't change what we did with it. Henry felt tears on his face. I'm sorry. I should have told you. I just wanted to protect you from more pain. If you're still following this story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the ending. James held Henry's hand. You gave us back our lives, our humanity. You fought for us. That's what matters. Not secrets you kept, not truths you hid. You saved us. Henry died 3 days later. Peaceful in his sleep, the subjects held his funeral. All 43 attended. So did their families. So did advocates and veterans and people Henry had helped over the years. They honored the engineer who'd bought a facility, who'd found frozen men, who'd cured them, who'd fought for them, who'd given them back their lives. James Wilson spoke at the funeral. Henry Davis was an ordinary man, an engineer, a widower, a retiree looking for a project. He could have ignored the frozen storage room, could have sealed it back up, could have called authorities and let them handle it. Instead, he opened it, saw our suffering, decided to help. That choice changed everything, changed our lives, changed how the government treats veterans, changed history. Henry kept one secret, one painful truth. He thought he was protecting us. Maybe he was right. Maybe knowing we were deliberately traumatized would have broken us. Or maybe it would have made us angrier, made us fight harder. We'll never know. But we know Henry cared. Know he tried his best. Know he gave us everything he had. That's what we'll remember. Not the secret he kept, but the life he gave us. They buried Henry near his wife Dorothy. His headstone was simple. Henry Davis, engineer, truth teller, saved 43 lives by refusing to look away. The subjects visited his grave regularly, brought flowers, told him updates about their lives, thanked him for everything. Years passed. The subjects aged slowly. The virus had changed them permanently. They aged at half speed, would live twice as long as normal humans. Some saw it as a gift, extra time to make up for the years lost. Others saw it as a curse, outliving everyone they loved, watching the world change again and again while they barely aged. 20 years after being thawed, the subjects formed an organization, the Frozen Veterans Association. Its purpose was helping other victims of military experiments, supporting them, advocating for them, making sure no one faced their trauma alone. The association found hundreds of victims not frozen, but harmed by experiments, radiation tests, chemical exposure, biological weapons trials, all done in the name of national security, all hidden for decades, all finally being acknowledged. 30 years after being thawed, James Wilson wrote a book about his experience, about being transformed, about being frozen, about Henry Davis, about fighting for accountability, about turning trauma into purpose. The book became required reading in military academies, taught future officers about ethics, about the cost of experiments on humans, about why some orders should be questioned. 40 years after being thawed, Robert Pierce died, first of the subjects to pass away. He was technically 103, but his body was only 65. He died surrounded by family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, 4 generations who knew him, who loved him, who understood what he'd survived. His funeral was attended by all the surviving subjects, 38 of them. 5 had died over the years. They were growing old finally, catching up to their actual ages. But they'd lived, really lived, made up for the 60 years stolen, made their survival matter. 50 years after being thawed, only 20 subjects remained, all in their 70s physically, over 100 chronologically. They gathered at Henry's grave, thanked him one more time, told him how their lives had gone, told him about the families they'd built, the advocacy they'd done, the changes they'd forced, told him it had all been worth it. James Wilson was the last to speak. Henry, we're old now, finally catching up to when we should have been old. We've outlived everyone from our generation, but we've also lived more than most people ever do. We've seen 2 different eras, survived impossible circumstances, changed the world by forcing accountability. That's because of you. because you bought a facility, because you opened a frozen room, because you refused to look away when you found us. Thank you for everything, for giving us this life, this chance, this purpose. 60 years after being thawed, James Wilson was the last surviving subject. He was technically 105. His body was 75. He'd outlived all his fellow subjects, all his friends from that frozen storage room. He was alone again, but not forgotten. The Frozen Veterans Association continued, run by the subjects' children and grandchildren. The cause lived on. The fight for accountability continued. The truth stayed told. James did one final interview, talked about his experience, about 60 years frozen, about 60 years living after being thawed, about what he'd learned, what he'd fought for, what he wanted people to remember. We were volunteers, wanted to serve, got betrayed, got experimented on, got frozen and forgotten. But we survived. We came back. We forced change. That's the lesson. Not that the government did wrong. Everyone knows that. The lesson is that victims can become advocates. Trauma can become purpose. Suffering can create meaning if you refuse to let it be wasted. Henry Davis showed us that. He was an ordinary man who did something extraordinary. He opened a door everyone else would have left sealed. He saw suffering and chose to help. He fought for people the government wanted forgotten. That's real heroism. Not the kind in movies, the kind that matters in real life. Be like Henry. When you find something wrong, don't look away. When you see suffering, choose to help. When institutions want to hide truth, demand it come out. That's how you change things. That's how you matter. James Wilson died peacefully at 75, technically 105. The last of the frozen subjects, the end of an era. His funeral was attended by thousands. Family, advocates, veterans, government officials, people whose lives had been changed by his story, by his fight, by his refusal to let trauma define him. They buried him at the military facility where he'd been frozen, where Henry had found him, where Compound 7 had given him back his humanity. The facility was a memorial now, preserved as a historical site, teaching people about the cost of unchecked military experiments, about the importance of accountability, about the danger of secrets. James Wilson's grave was next to a memorial listing all 43 subjects, their names, their service, their sacrifice, their survival. Visitors came from across the country, across the world, read the names, learned the stories, understood that government power came with responsibility, that soldiers deserved protection, not experimentation, that truth mattered more than secrets. The frozen storage room was preserved, empty now, the cylinders removed, but the cold remained, kept running as a reminder, a warning, a memorial to men who'd been frozen and forgotten, who'd survived the impossible, who'd turned trauma into change. 70 years after Henry opened that door, the story was still taught, still remembered, still inspiring people to demand accountability, to question authority, to insist on truth, because one engineer had refused to leave a frozen room sealed, had opened it, had seen suffering, had chosen to help. That choice had echoed through decades, had saved 43 lives, had changed how the government treated veterans, had proved that ordinary people could force extraordinary change. 100 years after Henry opened the frozen storage room, the facility had become one of America's most important historical sites. Millions visited every year, walked through the preserved labs, saw the frozen storage room, learned about Subject X and the 43 men, learned about Henry Davis, learned about accountability and truth and the cost of secrets. The Frozen Veterans Association had grown into a major organization, not just helping victims of military experiments anymore, but advocating for all veterans, for transparency in government, for ethical oversight of research, for protection of human subjects. The association's headquarters was at the facility, in the building where Henry had set up his lab, where he'd synthesized Compound 7, where he'd cured the first subject. Young advocates worked there, many of them descendants of the original 43, carrying on their grandfather's mission, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. One of them was Sarah Wilson, James Wilson's great-granddaughter. She was 35, had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather, about being frozen, about Henry Davis, about the fight for accountability. She dedicated her life to continuing that work. Sarah discovered something one day. Going through old files, archives that hadn't been fully digitized, she found a letter from Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, not the one Henry had found. A different letter, written in 1970, 8 years after the subjects were frozen, addressed to Henry Davis. Sarah read it with growing shock. Called the association's director. "You need to see this." Dr. Shaw had known about Henry, had known he'd bought the facility, had written to him before he even found the frozen storage room. The letter explained everything. Dr. Shaw had arranged the auction, had made sure Henry Davis saw the listing, had researched him, knew he was an engineer, knew he was recently widowed, knew he was looking for purpose. She'd wanted him to find the subjects, to find her notes, to synthesize Compound 7, to cure them. All of it was planned. Henry hadn't stumbled on the frozen storage room by accident. Dr. Shaw had led him there, from beyond the grave. She'd died in 1969, but she'd arranged everything before her death, made sure the facility would be auctioned, made sure certain documents would be preserved, made sure someone with the right skills would find her hidden subjects, would free them. Sarah shared the letter publicly. The revelation changed how people understood the story. Henry hadn't been a random Good Samaritan. He'd been chosen, guided. Dr. Shaw had orchestrated his involvement from beyond the grave. Some people were angry, said Henry's heroism was diminished, said he'd been manipulated. Others disagreed, said Henry still made the choice to help, still chose to fight for the subjects, still gave his savings and time. Being guided to the subjects didn't make his choices less meaningful. Sarah Wilson defended Henry's legacy. "My great-grandfather said Henry was a hero, that he gave them back their lives, that his choices mattered. I believe him." Dr. Shaw might have led Henry to the frozen storage room, but Henry chose what to do after opening it. He could have reported it and walked away. Instead, he spent 10 years fighting. That was his choice. That's what makes him a hero. The debate raged for months. Historians picked sides. Some said Henry deserved less credit. Others said he deserved more. Finally, the association made an official statement. Dr. Shaw's manipulation doesn't diminish Henry Davis's heroism. It proves she understood human nature. She knew the right person with the right skills and the right heart would make the right choice. She was right. Henry was that person. Let's honor both of them. Dr. Shaw for her planning and Henry for his execution. Both were necessary. Both mattered. 120 years after the subjects were frozen, new technology offered new possibilities. Scientists had advanced genetic engineering, could now safely modify DNA, could remove the lingering effects of Subject X from the remaining biological samples. The subjects were long dead, but their children had inherited some changes, aged slowly, lived longer than normal. Some saw it as a blessing, others as a curse. Now they could choose, could have the modifications removed, could age normally, could be fully human instead of partly changed. Some chose removal, wanted to be normal, didn't want to outlive their families, didn't want to be different. Others chose to keep the changes, saw them as part of their identity, part of their history, part of honoring their parents' suffering. Both choices were respected, both were understood. 150 years after the subjects were frozen, the last person who'd known any of them personally died. Robert Pierce's daughter, Linda. She was 112, had lived an incredibly long life partly because of inherited changes from her father. Before she died, she recorded a message. "I was 2 years old when my father was frozen. Don't remember him from before. My only memories are of him coming back, young, confused, traumatized. We built a relationship despite the strangeness, despite him being younger than me. He was a good father, a good man. He'd volunteered to serve his country, was betrayed, was experimented on, was frozen and forgotten, but he came back, survived, fought for accountability, changed things. I'm proud of him, proud to be his daughter, even if the circumstances were impossible, even if everything was strange. He mattered. His life mattered. His fight mattered. Remember that. Remember all of them. The 43 frozen subjects, Henry Davis, Dr. Shaw, all of them tried to do right, in their own ways, with their own choices. All of them mattered. Linda died peacefully, the last direct link to that era, to those people, to that impossible story. But the story didn't die with her. The memorial remained. The association continued. The lessons endured. 200 years after the subjects were frozen, humanity had spread beyond Earth. Colonies on Mars and the Moon. Stations in deep space. But people still visited the facility in Washington. Still learned about the frozen subjects. Still were inspired by Henry Davis's choice to help. Still understood that accountability mattered. That truth mattered. That ordinary people could change things. The facility had been carefully preserved, protected as a historical monument. Every building maintained exactly as it had been. The frozen storage room still ran, still kept at below zero, not for necessity anymore, but for memory, for symbolism, for teaching people what had happened here. Students came from across the solar system, studied the experiments, learned about Subject X, discussed the ethics, debated what should have been done. What choices were right? What choices were wrong? The storage room was the centerpiece. Visitors stood in the cold, looked at where the cylinders had been, imagined 12 men frozen for 60 years, 12 men transformed into monsters, 12 men who'd been experiments instead of soldiers. Then they walked through the building where Henry had worked, saw his notes, saw his lab equipment, saw the records of synthesizing Compound 7, understood that one man with chemistry knowledge and determination had done what the government refused to do, had cared when institutions didn't, had chosen to help when everyone else had chosen to forget. That lesson traveled across the solar system with humanity. That lesson shaped how colonies were governed, how research was conducted, how subjects were protected. No more hidden experiments, no more classified torture, no more frozen subjects waiting to be forgotten. Henry Davis had proven that individuals could hold power accountable, that citizens could demand better, that caring mattered more than following orders. 300 years after the subjects were frozen, the story had become legend, but true legend, documented, verified, taught as history, not myth. Every child across human civilization learned about it, about the Cold War, about military experiments, about 43 men betrayed by their country, about Henry Davis opening a door everyone else would have left sealed. The lesson was timeless. Power would always want to hide mistakes. Institutions would always prefer secrets to accountability. But individuals could resist, could demand truth, could force change. That's what Henry had done. That's what the frozen subjects had done after being saved. That's what Dr. Shaw had done by leaving a path to redemption. 400 years after the subjects were frozen, Henry Davis's name was carved on memorials across human civilization, on Mars, on Europa, on space stations orbiting distant stars. Everywhere humans had spread, they'd carried his story. Engineer, truth-teller, ordinary hero, proved that one person's choice to help could echo through centuries, could change civilizations, could inspire generations yet unborn. The frozen storage room still existed, still ran, still taught. Earth's government maintained it as a sacred site, the place where human accountability had been forced, where truth had won over secrecy, where one engineer had changed history by simply caring about 12 frozen strangers. New visitors came every day, stood in the cold, felt what those men had felt, understood suffering in a visceral way, left changed, left understanding that their choices mattered, that seeing suffering and choosing to help was the highest form of heroism. That was Henry's real legacy, not the 12 men he'd saved, though that was miraculous, but the lesson he'd taught, that caring about strangers was what made humans truly human. That choosing to help when you could easily walk away was what separated ordinary people from extraordinary ones. 500 years after the subjects were frozen, only one thing remained from that time: the facility itself. Everything else was gone. The people, the governments, the nations that had created the experiments, all transformed by time until they were unrecognizable. But the facility remained, protected, preserved, sacred. A reminder of when humanity had experimented on its soldiers, had betrayed its own, had hidden truth behind classifications, and a reminder of when one ordinary man had refused to accept that, had demanded better, had forced change. Visitors stood in the frozen storage room, 5 centuries after 12 men had been imprisoned there, 5 centuries after Henry Davis had opened the door. The cold remained, the memory remained, The lesson remained. Sarah Wilson's descendant worked at the facility. Her name was Elena Martinez Wilson. She was the 7th generation, had inherited the family calling, worked as a guide, told visitors the story, made sure it stayed real, stayed personal, stayed meaningful. She stood in the frozen storage room one morning, explaining to a group of students from Mars about what had happened here, about 12 men transformed into monsters, about being frozen for 60 years, about Henry Davis synthesizing a cure, about fighting for accountability. A young student asked a question. Why does this matter? It happened 500 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. Why should we care? Elena smiled. The question she'd been waiting for. Because it shows what humans can be. Both the worst and the best. The worst was betraying soldiers, experimenting on them, freezing them, forgetting them. The best was Henry Davis, ordinary engineer. No special training, no government authority. Just a man who opened a door and chose to help. Both extremes exist in all of us. We can choose to be the institution that hides mistakes. Or we can choose to be Henry Davis, the person who sees suffering and helps. That choice never stops being relevant, never stops being important. 500 years later, we still face it, every day, every one of us. Will we look away when we see something wrong? Or will we be like Henry? That's why this place matters. That's why we preserve it. That's why we teach the story. Not to shame the past, but to inspire the future. The student stood quietly, understanding something profound. That history wasn't just about knowing what happened. It was about learning what to do when faced with similar choices. The frozen storage room was a classroom, 500 years old, still teaching, still relevant, still changing people who walked through it. That was Henry Davis's immortality, not his name on monuments, though those existed, but his example, his choice, his proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things simply by caring about strangers, simply by refusing to walk away from suffering, simply by choosing to help. The cold air in the storage room felt meaningful, sacred even. This was where 12 men had been imprisoned, where they'd suffered for 60 years, where they'd been forgotten by everyone except a scientist who felt guilty and an engineer who cared. This was where humanity had been tested, had failed the test by creating the experiments, had passed the test when Henry opened the door. Both truths existed in this room. Both mattered. Both taught lessons worth remembering for 5 centuries, worth remembering for 5,000 centuries, worth remembering for as long as humans existed and made choices about whether to help or to hide. Elena Martinez Wilson finished her tour, led the students out of the frozen storage room, back into the warm Washington sun. But the cold stayed with them. The memory stayed with them. The lesson stayed with them. Some of those students would become doctors, would face choices about human subjects, would remember the 12 frozen men, would choose accountability over convenience. Some would become politicians, would face choices about transparency, would remember Henry Davis, would choose truth over secrecy. Some would become ordinary citizens, would see suffering in their communities, would remember that ordinary people could help, would choose to be like Henry instead of looking away. That was the multiplication of one choice. One engineer opening one door, 500 years later, still creating ripples, still changing people, still proving that caring mattered. That was worth more than gold, worth more than fame, worth more than anything money could buy. That was the real treasure Henry Davis had found in that frozen storage room. Not 12 men who needed saving, though they did, but the proof that one person's choice to care could echo through centuries, could change civilizations, could inspire countless others to make the same choice, to be the person who helps, instead of the person who hides. The frozen storage room would stand for another 500 years, another 1,000, as long as humans needed reminding that their choices mattered, that seeing suffering and choosing to help was the highest calling, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage. As long as those lessons needed teaching, Henry Davis's memorial would stand, cold and dark and sacred, the place where one man had proven that caring about strangers was the most powerful force in the universe. More powerful than governments, more powerful than secrets, more powerful than time itself.